Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to begin in the 12th verse of the 12th chapter of Mark, and we're going to try and make it all the way up till the 34th verse in the same chapter. Herein we read a trio of interesting dialogues, and dialogues are an interesting component of the Gospels, so not everything that the Savior says is more often than not, although we witness in the Sermon of the Mount, for instance, an explicit monologue, but then after, most of the things that he says occurs in dialogues, and his tones and approaches are usually different. He has a gentle yet often rebuking approach to disciples when they ask him questions or fail to understand certain things. And with his antagonist, he is alternately harsh and tactful, and we witness both of these in two of the two dialogues. And the first one is the question of taxation, and the second one is the question of the resurrection, and the final one is that of the two great commandments. And these are presented in the same order as the book of Matthew, and they are presented. The resurrection and taxes are in the order are presented in the same order in Luke's account, but the two great commandments emerges in a slightly different chronological and literary context in the Great Samaritan parable. And incidentally, it's not the Savior who says it, but I did comment extensively on this book in a book I wrote, Who is My Neighbor? An extensive commentary on the Good Samaritan parable. It is available for purchase at most online outlets. But to return to the subject itself, the reason we selected Mark's account as opposed to Matthew's is this is the only mention in Mark's account of the Sadducees, who are one of the two main religious factions during the dawn of the New Testament in Judaism. And there's an interesting item of the dialogue in the two great commandments. If we have enough time, we'll be able to get to that. But we're going to open with the 12th verse. But before we do that, we just want to establish the narrative context in which it emerges. This is after he delivers a parable in which he applies one of the chief cornerstone as written by the psalmist in the 118th chapter, 22nd verse of that book. He applies it to himself and implicitly chides his audience with being prophet killers who are soon to kill even the greater prophet in their midst, the very son of Elohim, who is if the prophets are the servants, then the son is certainly at a more exalted station of honor and rank. And after the repeated sending of prophets, which the Israelite people had a notorious habit of executing and persecuting, he finally sent his son, and this is presented in the parable of a vine grower or a vineyard, and the owner is convinced that they won't kill his son, yet they are greedy and rapacious and proceed to do just that, and this provokes a naturally hostile response. Now, the method of teaching in parables was very much, at other locations, it was to veil the truths he sought to communicate from his critics. He began to speak in veiled symbolisms and analogies, which were which were interpretable by those who had spiritually conditioned hearts to interpret it, but would have remained veiled from those who did not. Yet this one is an unmistakable allusion and provokes a violent response, of which we're going to read in the 12th verse, which reads, "And they were seeking to seize him, but feared the crowd, for they knew he had spoken the parable against them." So they were murderously motivated. They were forever seeking a pretext to indict him according to Jewish or Roman law, and but he carried the crowd. He was a popular preacher, and they were jealous of the itinerant preacher with no formal schooling, who was able to attract greater love, affection, and more sizable audience than them. And as we mentioned, the parable, they intuited that it was sharply directed against them. "And they sent him to some of the Pharisees and to the Herodians to catch him in a word." Now, the Pharisees and the Herodians, there is exactly nothing positive which would unite such an alliance. The Pharisees were patriotic, conservative, Orthodox Jews who were prominent at the synagogue level. They were prideful in their patriotism and would not submit to Rome, whereas the faction aligned with Herod owed his position to Rome. He was not even of Jewish blood. He was of Idumean stock, a descendant of Esau. So they would have been more favorably inclined to the Roman cause, which the Pharisees were otherwise antagonistic towards, but their contempt for this single man put aside temporarily all differences in their united zeal to trap him. And when they came, they said to him, "Teacher, we know that you are true, and it does not concern you about anyone, for you are not partial to any, but teach the way of Elohim in truth. Is it right to pay taxes to Caesar or not?" So the deference they're extending him as a teacher of what is true is nothing but a sham and a ruse. And as little did they know that he had supernatural insight into human nature, and he was able to read the intent and motives of the heart, such as they could not. So all their ostensible and superficial piety was essentially naked before him who had the supernatural insight into human nature that he did not. But the question, how it was asked, we've already established that. Now, what is asked is the question of taxation. Now, the Pharisees made it a point of pride to resist and rebel in whatever ways they could to the Roman authorities. So they would have been more inclined to not pay the taxes, but the Herodians were very much aligned with the Roman faction. So the sandwich which exists between these two ostensibly antagonistic antagonists united against a common antagonist is to trap him one way or the other, either according to Jewish or Roman law. So if he was found in violation of Roman law, the Herodians would turn him in, and the Pharisees were usually seeking to get him according to a violation of the Mosaic law. "Should we pay or should we not pay?" And he, knowing their hypocrisy, said to him, "Why do you try me? Bring me a silver piece to look at." So once more, he had intuition as to what their motives were, and he did not fall for their false deference in which they ask the manner of the question, and he makes it plain right off the bat, "Why do you try or tempt me?" So he knew there was a subterranean evil intent underneath their ostensible respect, and so he requests them to bring a silver piece, which would have been the currency then in existence in Rome. And they brought it, and he said to them, "Whose likeness and inscription is this?" And they said to him, "Caesar's." So this is a rhetorical question, and it establishes the verse which comes. So Yahshua said to them, "Give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to Elohim what is Elohim's." And they marveled at him. So this is taken as a stance of separation of church and state. Now, as Christians, we have dual citizenship. Our ultimate citizenship resides in heaven, Philippians 3:20, but we are also duty-bound to obey the laws of the nations on earth in which we reside, but only inasmuch as they do not interfere with the higher obedience that is owed to Elohim. So a Christian is not going to... it's his almost duty-bound to resist the fascist, the communist, and the Islamofascist structure, but the Romans they subscribed to the premise of ancient polytheism, according to which they conceived Yahweh as a national deity, and as such, rather than the universal deity that he knew he was, so they would have allowed the native people to pay homage and practice their religion essentially uninterfered, although several Roman emperors after Tiberius, who was ruling, beginning with Caligula, his successor, would implement the worship of himself, much as the Greeks and Oriental monarchs had done. And Sadducees, who say there is no resurrection, came to him, and they asked him, saying... So between the Pharisees and Sadducees, the Pharisees were politically antagonistic towards the Herodians, and the priestly or ecclesiastical antagonistic factions existed between the Sadducees and the Pharisees. And the Sadducees were the almost the modern equivalent of the contemporary Jewish liberal, in that they were cosmopolitan, they were appeasers and collaborators, they were the wealthy aristocrats, whereas the Pharisees, as we just described, would have been conservative and patriotic. But there was fundamental differences and disagreements in doctrine, and this was primarily rooted in the fact that the Sadducees refused to accept as canonical the laws and the writings, the 2/3 of what we call the Old Testament. They only accepted the Law of Moses, the Torah, or the Pentateuch as canonical, and there was no explicit reference in it to the resurrection, which they denied. They also denied angels, even though they are mentioned in the first 5 books of Moses. But that's going to come into play on the verse which the master rests his case on. Teacher, Moses wrote to us that if a brother of anyone dies and leaves his wife behind and leaves no children, and his brother should take his wife and raise up offspring for his brother. So they were familiar enough with the law of Moses, according to which no man could marry his brother's wife unless, of course, they had died. And this incidentally prompted the Protestant Reformation in England, when Henry had his pretext on the writings of Leviticus because he had married the original crown prince. His older brother Arthur was betrothed to Queen Catherine of Aragon of Spain, and the father didn't want to lose the substantial dowry, so Henry VII maintained the wedding contract. He simply shifted it to his new successor, who became Henry VIII. There were 7 brothers, and the first took a wife and died, leaving no offspring. And the second took her, and he died, leaving behind no offspring. And the third likewise. And the 7th left no offspring. Last of all, the woman died too. So this is an unusual hypothetical, an ostensibly unlikely one, in that a woman would go through 7 brothers as husbands in the course of one lifetime, and this sets up the question. In the resurrection, then, when they rise, whose wife shall she be? For she had her as wife. So they made no secret of the fact that they flat out denied the doctrine of the resurrection, which was by this point an ingrained tenet in what became Orthodox Jewry. The Pharisees survived to become the progenitors of the modern Orthodox Judaism, whereas the Sadducees, who were more prominent at the temple level, whereas the Pharisee authority was generally uncontested at the synagogue level, they went extinct after the destruction of the temple by the Romans in 70 A.D. But more to the passage itself. And Yahshua answering said to them, Is it not why you go astray, because you do not know the Scriptures, nor the power of Elohim? So these are essentially fighting words to what would have been ecclesiastical superiors, or would have at least outranked him. They would have occupied the most prominent positions at the temple level of worship because they were wealthy aristocrats and whatnot. For when they rise from the dead, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are as messengers, as angels in the heavens. So the resurrection, we will be granted eternal bodies, and there is no need for procreation, because after that point, there's no need. We procreate on this earth, and with the hope or expectation or the unlikelihood that our seed will make it to that blessed abode. But henceforward, then after, there is no necessary there's no necessity for procreation, and hence no need for the arrangement of marriage, which is an earthly institution, which as such has no place in heaven. And concerning the dead, that they rise, have you not read in the book of Moses at the bush how Elohim spoke to him, saying, I am the Elohim of Abraham, and the Elohim of Isaac, and the Elohim of Jacob. So he was quoting a familiar passage, Exodus 3:6, which would have been known to them, and the tension of the word am is significant, because the implicit inference is that he was not a God of the living, but of the dead, but of the living, so that the patriarchs of their faith were still around when Moses walked the earth and are still around today by connection. He is not the Elohim of the dead, but Elohim of the living. You then go greatly astray. So he accused them of fundamentally misapplying or misunderstanding the intent of the author to whom they exclusively rested canonical authority on, that being Moses. And Moses implicitly endorsed the resurrection in this passage, but they had not the spiritual receptivity of heart to gauge the message, and their ultimate argument against the doctrine of the resurrection was therefore faulty. Now, in the writings in the prophets, the book of Job, in the 16th Psalm, and also in Daniel, the 12th chapter, 3rd verse, and a few other places throughout the writings of the prophets, the resurrection is more explicitly affirmed, although that word itself appears nowhere in the Old Testament. Its connection is clear when interpreted properly. But we're actually going to save the two great commandments for another date, and what we might do is compare the accounts in each account and read them separately for the sake of time. But that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. Tune in soon. See you then. Bye-bye.